Rewards were on offer to anyone who could find a way to make the telegraph more efficient. So the race was on. Hundreds of men of science applied their massive brains to the problem, but few came close. One of them, however, was Alexander Graham Bell. Alexander Graham Bell was born in Edinburgh. He was clumsy, impulsive, enthusiastic, fiercely ambitious, and he was an obsessive thinker. And what he was thinking was, surely you can send more than a simple dot and dash down a length of copper wire. And so it was. In 1871, at the age of 24, he upped sticks and moved to Boston, Massachusetts. New England and a new life. It was here that Bell came to seek his fortune. And while he waited for his fortune to turn up, he filled in time teaching deaf people to communicate.
I'm going to show you how sound works.
He was convinced that the answer to the telegraph problem lay in sound, not speaking, not the telephone, just sound as a way of making Morse code more efficient. His idea meant turning sound vibrations into electrical signals. But he couldn't. The trouble is, Bell was in a race. Thousands of miles away in Ohio, there was a humble Quaker farmhand called Elisha Gray, and he had worked out how you could transmit sound down a piece of copper wire. The improbably bearded Elisha Gray had seen the electric telegraph transform his rural backwater and had been fascinated by it ever since. By the age of 38, Elisha, who'd attended night school, had become an expert in electricity. So much so that the men who ran telegraph giant Western Union were backing him as their man in the making the telegraph more efficient race. Their faith in Gray was well placed. He was about to take the lead thanks to some batteries, a bathtub, and a 9-year-old boy. Elisha Gray's nephew had found his uncle's batteries in the bathroom and had discovered that he could use them to make a strange new sound by rubbing his hand along a zinc bathtub. As is the way with adults, Gray immediately wanted to have a go with the new toy himself. He realized that he was making an electrical circuit. Small amounts of electrical current were traveling from the batteries through Gray's body and back into the battery, but oddly, the electricity seemed to be causing some sort of very faint noise, which was amplified by the bath. Gray found that by altering the position of his hand, he could change the length and resistance of the electrical circuit, but crucially, as he moved his hand, the sounds changed too. Gray had discovered that electricity can carry sound. It was the first in a chain of events that would lead eventually to the invention of the telephone, but at the time, Gray had no idea of the significance of his buzzing bath. Meanwhile, back in Boston, the ambitious Scot was keen to move on with his ideas and acquired staff in the form of skilled craftsman Thomas Watson. Bell had abandoned the idea of multiple messages and was going hell for leather in pursuit of the talking telegraph, even though he still had no idea how to electrify speech.
If I could make a current of electricity vary as precisely as the air varies during the production of sound, I should be able to transmit speech telegraphically.
Mr. Bell, I feel the tuning fork will be no good. The vibrations are too weak.
But the vibrations are the key. It's the sound as we see it. I mean, subtle as they are. It's those that we must capture.
Then it must be a thinner metal.
Bell may have hit on the idea for a telephone, but over in Ohio, Elisha Gray was about to work out how to actually build one.
Hey, shouting.
Again, Gray's nephew was on hand with a breakthrough. Gray was struck by the remarkable similarity between the vibrations of a string carrying the boy's voice and his own work with the telegraph. Back in his lab, Gray set about building a machine that could transmit different sounds. Gray, like Bell, had decided that sound was the key to a better telegraph, and he was intent on using different musical notes. Critically, he hadn't made the leap to speech. He was hell-bent on using music to send multiple Morse messages for Western Union. And so, in January 1874, Elisha Gray had the basis for what we now know as the telephone. Enthused by the idea and in search of cash, Elisha made the journey here, to Chicago. Full of trepidation, the unassuming inventor demonstrated his harmonic telegraph to his paymasters from the telegraph company. But even though they understood that Gray could transmit sound and they could hear the evidence, the men from Western Union didn't make the leap to speech either. And they weren't impressed. They wanted more than one message at a time in Morse code down one wire as discussed. Humming, music, talking, they'd be ridiculous. So needless to say, the check was never written. Now, you can forget the man who turned down the Beatles. That has to be one of the costliest mistakes in the whole of human history. At about the same time in Boston, the altogether luckier Bell wasn't being downtrodden by the kind of visionaries who'd hamstrung Gray. The immigrant Scott and his technician were hot on the heels of Elisha Gray and were also discovering all about sound going down wires. The tuning fork idea was about to bear fruit, albeit accidental fruit.
Mr. Watson, do I have the right connections here?
Yeah. Are they all tightened?
Yes. I'll proceed now. Please take note.
Mr. Bell, a moment. The reed is stuck.
The sound of Watson's fumblings were carried along the wires down the corridor.
What did you do?
The reed was stuck, so I took...
Do it again! Repeatedly!
Without realizing it, Bell and Watson had made a sort of primitive microphone. Even so, it was nowhere near sensitive enough to pick up the human voice. The transmission of speech was still a long, long way from reality, and certainly nowhere near Boston. Back in the Midwest, Elisha Gray had finally hit on the idea of talking, but he too was short of a microphone. Alone and without funding, Gray continued his research and hit on an idea to capture speech vibrations in a liquid. It was a brilliant and crucial breakthrough. Gray's drawing showed a telephone system that would have worked. Gray had no idea of the value of his diagram, but being a professional inventor, he sent it along with a whole stack of other ideas to the US Patent Office. Gray had done what he did routinely, only this time his patent application would change his life forever. Back in Boston, Bell was still unable to get his telephone system to work. But knowing that the Gray posse were on their way to Washington loaded with ideas, Bell sent his idea to the US Patent Office too, just in case. Only it was less of a practical solution than a statement of intent. Kind of, wouldn't it be brilliant if we had a telephone? So, on Valentine's Day 1876, couriers for both men arrived at the patent office. It was Bell's man with Bell's telephone idea who arrived first and presented it